There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel. And another, in this case, Saturday reads, because I am dragging my feet today. So I'm not going to get this published Friday night. It's going to go out sometime Saturday, and I haven't done that for, goodness, many months. And I have had a good reading week, and I don't think I have anything personal to say, other than that I've been celebrating the death of that homophobic asshole, James Dobson. Oh, that was such good news. What a good death for the world. Other than that, not much going on here. Kenji does another couple days of training next week, and then starts working in earnest the week after. Oh, one more bit of news I just about forgot is that I bought 2 new bookshelves because I needed them to get all my books unpacked in the basement. And then my mum has a handyman that she's been using for odd jobs. Using sounds rather utilitarian, but affable fellow named Ken. And so I had Ken come over and put them together. It took him a long time. Those bookshelves are lovely, but they are a bitch to put together. My nephew and I almost got divorced because he put 3 of them together and he refused to put any more. I had one more that I hired somebody else to put together, and he didn't enjoy it, and this guy didn't enjoy it. Ay, ay, ay. But the library is in progress, and the next big thing is in maybe mid-September. I'm going to have a picture hanging party because I haven't hung up any art yet. I just got another lovely piece back from the framers this week. We're going to have the same handyman and some other friends who have good taste to situate and hang the pictures. And I'm sure they will be very well hung indeed. Moving on. In fact, moving on to this week's extraordinarily interesting mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is the Canadian writer Bruce Hunter, joining us today from Thornhill, which is near Toronto. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here talking to you today.
The honor is all mine. Bruce is the author of a very meaty novel that sounds absolutely incredible, and it's been reissued. The reissue came out in May of this year from Frontenac House, and it is called In the Bear's House. And look at that cover. It's an amazing cover. It's also been translated into Italian this year. Bruce is having a banner year. In the Bear's House was originally published in 2009.
By Wilkin Books of BC, which unfortunately is no longer a viable press.
So I am very curious about this novel. Tell us what it's all about, Bruce.
Basic story is about a young, very creative and intelligent mother raising a young deaf child in the late 50s and early 60s. And it's inspired partly by my own mother and partly by my own story. But it is also a work of imagination and historical research to capture the ethos of the time, what it was like for not only people with disabilities, but First Nations, all kinds of people who were different in some way. And in some very unfortunate cases that we know with the residential schools, they were sent to rather awful circumstances. I'm not conflating disability with First Nations at all, but what I am saying is there was a time where values were quite distorted, and that lasted for a long time. It wasn't until, I think, 1970, a little bit after, that some of the residential schools were faded out, and also the Alberta Eugenics Act and the Eugenics Board was canceled. And that was the year I graduated high school. So to give you a context of the ethos of the province, but I also did the novel to try to understand my parents' time and what it was like raising a child with a disability given the ethos of the time. And the story follows the young boy, Trout, who was deafened as an infant, and his journey. And along the way, he gets sent to live with a great uncle who is a deaf forest ranger in the wilds of Alberta. And Trout learned from his uncle how to be deaf, how to function. And his uncle is what we call high functioning, actually quite an incredible man. And he faces his own challenges. in the backcountry, and it's a time of great upheaval. The land nearby has been appropriated for one of the largest power dams and lakes, man-made lakes in Alberta. And this is the historical research that comes in. And what motivated me there was that I did live in that area, not nearly as long as my character, but even as a 9-year-old boy, which is what I was at the time, I went up to Kootenay Plains. And Kootenay Plains is, unlike what the name suggests, not in BC, but in Alberta, and it's where the Kootenay came to trade with the Plains Cree. And it's about 100 miles northeast of Banff, outside the national park, but just. And I witnessed what was going on. I'm 9 years old. My narrator is 13 years old in order to move the story ahead into the time when all of these things were happening. So it's on the one level, a story of disability and challenge, and also the mother has her own challenges, the uncle, and it's also a story about land theft. Even though as a 9-year-old I couldn't understand the complexity of the politics, I certainly understood what it meant if your mom and dad suddenly lost their house, their job, the city they lived in, the way to make a living, their food sources, all of that. So I understood it on that level. And so my young narrator is a witness to many things, including this. It's also a celebration of the wilderness and the wildness. And I think anyone who lives in the backcountry or is a mountain climber or does any of that kind of thing understands the danger. But the other side that I try to portray is the joy of living in the backcountry, living alongside all kinds of interesting people and also wildlife. And then there is the physical landscape, which one of my reviewers mentioned as a key character in the book.
You used the term land theft a minute ago, and that is a lightning rod of a term that some of the viewers, perhaps that are not Canadian or outside of North America, might not know what you're referring to. So I wonder if you could just fill in a little bit more about land theft.
I'm happy to do that because it was a new phrase to me. I had the experience of seeing this, and then I did the research where basically the land was taken away from a group of people who had lived on the land and who were covered under Treaty 7, and a huge lake and a huge power dam put in without any consultation, no public consultation with anyone. And as I did the research, I saw the names of politicians on the letters okaying this appropriation of the land. And these were politicians that I'd respected until then. Peter Lougheed, John Kristjana, one of our great prime ministers, and Peter Lougheed was, of course, one of Alberta's great premiers and also a human rights advocate. He was the one who abolished the eugenic board and brought in significant legislation around human rights and so on. But land theft refers to, very simply in the context I'm using it, the theft of land from First Nations or Indigenous people.
And this is set, I believe, around 1972. It may start a bit earlier and go past that, but the Big Dam project was 1972, thereabouts,
Yeah,
right?
it does. I'm covering a time period, most significantly the late 50s, early 60s, but certainly into the future. But there's also segues into the 1880s where I'm talking about, they didn't call themselves pioneers, they called themselves old timers. These were the people that came up by wagon before the railway, by stagecoach, ox cart up from Fort Benton, Montana. And these were hardy people, and they were also very fashionable. They prided themselves on being able to do many things, whether it was to shoot a gun, but also they got dressed up. They got dressed up for church events, of course, parties, family events. And the Glenbow Museum in Calgary has an outstanding collection of fashion from the turn of the last century, and designers from all the world come. Because Calgary was a wealthy town. A lot of people came with money, and many times it was, as in the case of my family and in Peter Lougheed's family, it was a woman who had the funds to build the enterprises that the men succeeded from. So there's an interesting series of backstories. And I've been told by the critics that this is a novel that is about strong women. And I was certainly very privy to knowing those women, great aunties and Scottish great grandmothers and all kinds of things. So I had a circle of women around me who helped raise me, but also inspired the imagination.
So let's segue right from that to tell us more about the strong woman, the young boy's mother.
Claire tells the novel. It is told from her point of view.
I see.
And that came about as a false start. I was 3 years into the novel, third person omniscient from the point of view of the deaf boy. And through my research, I realized if I did not tell the story of the mother, then I had an incomplete story, because it's very often the mother who recognizes initially that the child has a disability of any type. She turned to her family for advice, and they're a Scottish immigrant family. They're people that don't have a lot of money. Nobody had money after the war. There was a rebuilding of Canada and men returning from overseas and also from Korea. So that's part of the context. But she turned to her family, and this is the fictional part of the book. The boy's grandmother, Claire's mother, when they learn that the baby can't hear, says, we'll surround him, we'll bathe him in sound. And I love that sentiment, because what that means is the young boy, even though he may not have the ability to discern what people are saying in sentences and has great difficulty in school, hears the hubbub of music and conversation and laughter around him. So he has an entry point into sound. And to segue the story a little further, he also has a great auntie who came west by wagon before the railroad up from Fort Benton. And she brought with her, because she's from the Maritimes, she's from New Brunswick, and she's a woman of some financial means, not wealthy, but certainly an independent woman who has money, and married the baker, and they run a bakery together. But one of her prized possessions is a conch shell given to her by her father, passed on from her grandfather, who was a slaver and ran slave boats. So this ties together a lot of different history. But the young boy, Trout, gets the conch shell, and his great auntie said, put it up to your ear and you'll hear the sea. Of course, he doesn't have hearing aids at this point, and he's deaf. But he doesn't hear the sea, but he does hear the vibrations of the city around him. And it's basically bone conduction through the conch shell onto the jaw and into the cochlea. So that's the first part. The second part is he takes it home, and this is a little bit of a magic realistic leap here. He begins to rehear the fragment of his great auntie's stories. And as he rehears and he goes back to the conch shell, and he's able to put together these stories and develop a complete narrative. And of course, that's all about imagination. That's what the young boy does, and that's what writers do. We're taking the scraps of what we get from the world, and we're trying to put them together in a poem, or a story, or a song, or a painting. And the conch becomes a magical device for the boy. It's his first hearing aid. And of course, hearing is as much imagination as it is sound.
Fascinating. Now, when I hear the word conch, I immediately flash back to The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. And when they were on that island, the rules they made was if you had the conch in your hand, you got to speak. And it's probably too much of a stretch, but now my mind is leaping over into what you're telling me about in the bear's house, and that this is Trout speaking, his voice coming through in the novel.
It's a parallel plot. So it alternates between Claire's voice, first person, which is a very intimate voice, and then, to use a film term, the wide pan, the wide view from the boy's point of view. So we get both the dialogue, which Clara can hear, and we get what Trout is able to piece together, and often very well sometimes because people understand that he has difficulty. So they do some very simple things that I think were intuitive, but also very kind. They pull him close. They make an effort to focus on his face. And a lot of what he does is what I call multisensory listening. In other words, he's using the eyes, he's watching people, he's watching the movement of the animals in the landscape, whether they're bears or other smaller animals or the dogs. Eventually, he ends up caring for the dogs on the ranger station, which are sled dogs. I was 50 some years old when I did my first dog sled run, and I wanted to quit my job, become a dog sledder. It's a wonderful experience if you haven't done it.
Have not done it. That sounds amazing. Maybe two more questions on the novel before we move on. How far do we follow Trout's story into his life?
We follow it right up until his graduation
High school?
from high school. And just to back up the story a little bit, this is a young man who faces enormous challenges. And if you understand teaching, a lot of our teaching is based on the assumption that everybody can hear and everybody can see. And that, of course, is not true. And this is just one example. Also, the fact that everybody's included, which is not true either, because there is systemic discrimination. There has been for a long time. That is part of what the residential schools were about. For the deaf and people with intellectual and other disabilities, psychological disabilities, there were training schools, but you were sent to live at the training school. My character, like me, would have been sent to the Jericho Hill School for the Blind and Deaf in Vancouver. And the mother in the novel, like my mother, and like many of the mothers I interviewed, fight for their kids because the system has one idea about how to handle people, and it's not one solution fits all. It never is. There's a real passionate engagement on the mother's part, but she herself is also seeking education as well. So it's a journey, not without its challenges, but there is a lot of development and redemption. I couldn't have written this book if it didn't end with hope and redemption.
And then, in a way, I've been remiss not to bring up the title and the cover illustration before now, but it's called In the Bear's House, and we got a big bear on the cover, and we haven't talked about that yet. So, what is all this about?
Let's talk about bears.
Absolutely.
I am going to show you the cover of the Italian edition, which
Yeah,
is my
beautiful.
wife's photograph, and the title is Nella Casa dell'Orso. And in Italian, it translates literally as In the House of the Bear. And the title is actually a backcountry analogy, and it refers to the idea that you're in the bear's house now. Mind your manners. And what that means is keep your wits about you, be observant, and understand that this is not your house. You are in someone else's house, and they are accustomed to their way of living, their way of life. The psychological illusion I'm getting at there is probably everybody in the novel is themselves a bear. They're fiercely independent. You could say stubborn, or more diplomatically resilient and creative. And I was raised differently because of that time I spent when I was 9 years old. I was raised or grew up alongside people, First Nations, particularly Stoney Nakoda, and these Scottish Rangers who were a paramilitary outfit, but on the other hand, they lived in the backcountry, and the rules are different. One of the differences is you can't go out there scared. And my own opinion of this is I think the biggest disability, the worst disability to have is fear. And what the boy learns through the book, living in the bear's hut, is not to fear bears, but to respect and understand them and recognize them as unique creatures. And that, I think, transfers to the people he meets as well. They're unusual, they're unorthodox. I think one of the things he learns is that being normal doesn't work, whatever normal is. In other words, he's got to be creative and adaptive. And we often think of creativity in the arts, but part of the message in the novel is the creativity of the people that the young boy encounters. And they are a generation that if you didn't have it, you made it. And if you couldn't make it, you did without. And that's, I think, one of the powerful lessons in the book. But getting back to bears, one of the sort of conflicts in the novel is the different our culture, and I'd say colonial culture, settler culture, whatever you want to call it, is our fear. Our fear of the wilderness, the wild, bears, of mountains. And I was just out in Alberta. I was actually maybe 60 miles from the real bears. I was on Kootenay Plains, and I was on the trail, just part of it. I just went out for a little walk, where 2 hikers were killed 3 weeks ago. And they were killed in a rock slide. And my awareness of the backcountry, not just around bears, but around mountains, and I allude to this in the book because there's quite a bit of mountain lore. And that's one of the reasons why I won the Canadian Rockies Prize at the Banff Mountain Film and Book Festival, was the writing about the mountains. Which is ironic because I thought I was writing a novel about a deaf boy. I stood on the stage looking out at all the people with their hiking boots on and their anoraks and stuff. This is in Banff. And there I am. And they're highly critical of people who write about the mountains. But one thing about the mountains is they're always moving. Mountains are in motion. There's water inside them. There's a kinetic shift, a seismic shift in massive amounts of rock. And that's what they've been doing for millions of years. So when I'm in the mountains, and I did climb at a point when I was younger, I knew how dangerous it was because of the fragility, the rocks and the rock slopes. But that was also part of the excitement. We knew we were on edge and we had to keep our wits about you all the time. And that's, I think, something I go back to from my youth. It's that mountain climbing experience.
Wow, it just sounds incredible. I can't wait to read it, and I hope that I can have you back to talk about it in more depth once I have.
I would be happy to do that. It's been such a pleasure to go on the road and go on the web talking about a novel that I wrote quite a few years ago. And as one of the blurbers on the back of the book said to me in person, is that you were ahead of your time when you wrote this. And that's interesting because I think our consciousness now around things like residential schools and land theft and all of that is very different than it was when the novel was first published. I think people are getting the story on a different level. And I also think a younger generation is as well. And that was one of the things I wanted to do, with take stories which, first of all, were never known in some cases, and second of all, were heard but not written down. And I'm saying this all around the table. So my attempt here was to record this and put in writing something that could be passed on, hopefully, for future generations.
What are you working on now, Bruce?
I have been so busy with the Italian edition. I did a 4-city tour in Italy, which was very successful. And there's a universality to the story about family, about the child with disability and the mother struggles with her problems, and including mental illness. So there's universality to that story no matter where you go. But I started as a poet, and the book I'm working on right now is poetry. Okay. Largely based on travel to different places around the world. And I'm from a working class family. I've never lost that view of maybe people whose stories don't get told. And so I have a sensitivity to that whenever I travel, and I suspect that's one of the reasons so many of my books have been translated in Italy, and I have another one coming, which is going to be my short stories. So that's the translation project I'm working on. Do I sound busy?
You sound very busy, and you have told me how old you are. I won't ask you to reveal that to the world here, but I'm jealous of how you're doing at this stage of your life and how much hair you still have. It's really pissing me off, Bruce.
You know what? I'd be happy to donate. I'm at the age where I looked in the mirror a couple of years ago and I went, "Oh my God, I've got hair on my shoulders." I've reached that point in life. I'm 73, and I'm going to say that because I am. And contrary to all the mythology, 73 is the new 73, and I embrace it. But it's wonderful to be at this stage in my life and still be active. And I have to have an afternoon nap and so on, but that's fine. I think I probably always have, except when I was working. But I think if I can speak to younger and older writers the same age, or anybody, to use a baseball metaphor, it's all about staying in the best physical shapes you can stay in and psychological shape, which is to be optimistic and be hopeful and find reason for that. In my case, this is my grandchildren. The other part is to keep getting up to bat. You're going to get a lot of walks, a lot of runs, strikeouts. Home runs are really rare, even for the best of players, and you give it your best. And I've had 2 home runs where I hit it out of the stadium. Nobody is more surprised than me to have a book in translation in Italy, and people responded to it, and to have a re-release, which is unusual. But I think the reason for that, I'm going by what people tell me, not what I think. I'm always reflecting and saying, what could I have done better? And one of my mentors is Wallace Stegner, Wolf Willow. But the model for this novel was Big Rock Candy Mountain. And it's a sprawler. It's like my book. It's an epic, intergenerational family, all kinds of social ethos as well. And the other great prairie classic, of course, is Who Had Seen the Wind. I pay homage to that in the book.
That's W.O. Mitchell, right? Wasn't he a mentor of yours? Didn't you study under him or something?
I had the great pleasure. I trained as a gardener and an arborist. And it was a difficult point in my life. I'd be in my late, mid-20s. And I was losing my vision. And I was going to lose my job because I couldn't drive anymore, all that kind of stuff. And I did a crazy thing. I applied for a poetry scholarship to the Banff School of Fine Arts. And lo and behold, I got it because I published a fair bit of poetry while I was working. I had this blue-collar job, and I wrote at night or whenever I could, and I submitted to magazines like Grain Magazine and got accepted. So anyway, I went to Banff, and I was not a fiction writer at that point, but I learned Mitchell's messy method, free fall. And basically, you sit down at a keyboard and you don't think, you don't overthink, you don't plot, you don't plan, you just go, and you type it fast as you can. And I was writing these 2 words on a line kind of poems. Our jeans were baggy, but our poems were skinny. And I had a breakthrough. I wrote my first piece of prose, and it was well responded to. And to make a long story short, I got invited back to Banff for a second summer. And Mitchell was a great storyteller and teacher and orator and so on. And eventually I got invited back to teach with Mitchell.
Wow.
And I'm at this exciting point in my life where I've made a transition from my blue-collar job into academia. And I never really felt like an academic in the usual sense because I had a big different background and a different kind of training. But that was a wonderful period because I think it showed me, again, when I go back to saying the greatest disability is fear. I was afraid of stepping into the world of prose and fiction. And my God, a long novel. I owe a great deal, as do many writers, to W.O. Mitchell.
Wow, this is a very inspiring conversation indeed. Let's close, Bruce, with some, I think you have some books there to recommend.
One of the books I would recommend, and I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of, is Willow by Wallace Stegner. And that is one of the great books of the time. It's nonfiction. His other work, Big Rock Candy Mountain, Angle of Repose, those are great books of fiction. One of my academic friends refers to him as one of the best American writers of the mid-century. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think he's often better known as a teacher of Ken Kesey and Wendell Berry and all those kinds of people. The other book I would mention, which is a little bit different, many of your viewers may have heard of A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean. The other book is Young Men and Fire. And it is a story about a famous forest fire in Montana called the Gulch Man Fire. And what happens in this fire is that a group of smoke jumpers is trapped on a slope. And the foreman of the crew realizes they're trapped. And this is the first time in recorded history that someone had used this. He dropped a match into the dry grass around him. And he told his men, "Don't run. I'm going to burn this out and we'll be safe here because the fire is going to jump over us. It's not going to go through us." Unfortunately, some of the men on his crew panicked and ran ahead of the fire. Of course, the fires move at such a rapid pace, it caught up with them. The men who stayed with him survived because he lit this grass on fire. I grew up alongside firefighters, forest firefighters, and my granddad was training captain for Calgary Fire. I heard a lot of fire stories, and that is just one of the things I try to bring into the book is the reality of people who face survival challenges and how quickly they adapt, just like Norman Maclean. It's a nonfiction book, but it's an excellent book if you want to understand the science of fire.
Getting back for a moment to Willow by Stegner. So it is about his childhood. His family moved to East End, Saskatchewan. And I believe, was he born there?
That part I can't remember, but
maybe not born there. Significant amount of his childhood was in East End, Saskatchewan, and that's what the book is about.
Yeah, it's his father was a rum runner, and one of my favorite images his youth with his father, and I had that experience with my father. My father was a drinker and a rounder, and he would go to these sketchy bars, and I would tag along. It's amazing how many places you can get into when you're 9 years old, and nobody notices you. But I like that in his storytelling because he's a witness to what his father is up to. And one of the scenes is where they're in the Cypress Hills, and it's an old Model T, I believe, and the father puts it in reverse and goes up the hill backward. And the car has rum in it and all that stuff, in other words, it's fairly weighty, but the reverse gear is lower than the first gear. Hence the logic for going up backward. But there's little details like that in Stegner that are so vivid. And as I say, we're seeing the world through the eyes of a young witness.
This has been a fascinating conversation. And in a sense, I am the umpire, Bruce. I'm hosting you, and it's on my YouTube channel. So I get to call the balls and strikes. So I'm going to say this conversation was a complete and utter home run. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I have to say that I found Bruce Hunter an inspiring guest, and he's left me with some things personally to chew on, based on some of the incredible things he said. And the novel, here it is, sounds very intriguing. All right, I've had a great reading week. Maybe not as stupendous as last week, but still really good. And so I've got 3 books that I finished to talk about. And I'm going to check in on 2. And I'm going to be starting 3. Oh my God, John, what are you doing? I finished this queer memoir, Crooked Teeth by Danny Ramadan, a queer Syrian refugee memoir. And I read it to Mary Jean, and we both enjoyed it. I would say that I loved it. It wasn't uniformly wonderful, but most of it was just stupendous. And as I think I said when I did a preliminary check-in, he starts the memoir with an address to the reader, and there are at least two more through the course of the memoir where he actually just talks to the reader, which I found very effective. In a way, it was old school in terms of like Victorian novels, but for me it really worked, and it injected a challenging critique of Western values and Western readers' expectations of a memoir like this, specifically related to trauma, because he does experience a lot of trauma, and he directly addresses the reader about why they would expect him to reveal every gory detail of that, which I thought was wonderful. But probably what I loved the most was his really vivid, emotion-laden descriptions of queer joy that he found in Syria pre-revolution. He was invited to join a community of gender non-conforming queer people in Syria, run by a trans woman who was everybody's mother, and they had a genealogical chart of how she named them in relationship to each other, and that was just exquisite. And then he took that example and he created something that was equally valuable in an emotional and social way when he lived in Beirut, and then he found community like that in Vancouver when he came to Canada. And that shatters a lot of myths about how dire the situation. The situation was dire, but we have these myths that there was no gay life available for anybody, or no place for private joy. And he tells us a lot about all that I found really quite beautiful. I recommend this very highly, and I'm hoping to do a full-length interview with Danny this fall sometime. The next one I'm a little confused about, so I have vowed to reread it fairly soon. This is one of the novellas for the novella reading project that I have annually with the Calgary novellaist, Barb Howard, and she assigned me this Icelandic-Canadian novella, The Prowler, by Kristjana Gunnars. And wow, what a wild ride this was. I don't know if I got it. It was very postmodern, and what kept me going through the postmodern bits, because I think a lot of that stuff, theory, Derrida, deconstruction, blah, 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 is nonsense. But she kept me engaged with it because she talked about story and narrative being about love. And that was threaded through all this theoretical stuff. A lot of the theoretical stuff went over my head, but I found it really provocative in an interesting way. Unlike all that other crap, Derrida and all the stuff I had to study in the 90s. Oh my God, what rot. And it's told in these little numbered paragraphs or short sections that is supposedly fiction, or perhaps autofiction, about her childhood, or the narrator's childhood, in Iceland. The father was Hungarian, I'm quite sure. I had to go back and I couldn't quite find the reference again. That's something I gotta pay more attention to on a reread. And the mother was Danish, or was she just an Icelander who'd lived in Denmark and then came back? Those details were a little fuzzy for me. But their impoverished life when she was growing up post-World War II in Iceland, her sister seemed to have an even harder time. The memories of visiting grandparents back in Copenhagen, all very vivid, but in between so many of these bits of narrative, these fragmentary narratives, were all these ruminations on narrative. Let me just read you another one. This is fragment 69. The text desires to be true. It knows that what is written is not exactly true, so the desire goes unsatisfied. The story repeats the attempt at telling itself. The text tells all other texts, there is only one of me. I found that interestingly befuddling, and I am going to reread it to prepare for my wrap-up discussion with Barb about all, was it 6 or 8 of the novels? I can't remember how many we're reading, because it was intriguing, but a lot of that theoretical stuff went way over my head. And finally, I finished doing this British-African novel on audio. I have an ex-library copy that's in mint condition. I think I was probably the first person to read it. And I've seen videos on how to strip off all the ugly library damage, but I'm pretty lazy, so I don't know if I'll ever do it. But Sankofa by Chibundu Onuzo. This is, I guess, her third novel. I don't know anything about her first novel, and I really enjoyed this. I bailed on her last novel, Welcome to Lagos, because I thought that it reached a certain plot point where it got ridiculously sentimental, and I couldn't stomach that. And this one was a much more accomplished novel in that regard. I guess also I enjoyed it because the audiobook was wonderful. This is one of the ones where I loved the audio narration so much that I wonder if that's why I enjoyed the book, and I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much if I just read it. Occasionally I have those experiences where I think, how much of my delight in this is because it's so well narrated. But no, I think it was a very fine novel, not a perfect one. But the protagonist is in her maybe 30s or 40s, I think. And she is mixed race. Her mother was white and her father was African. She never knew him. And then after her mother dies, she finds her father's journals, which gives information about him that enables her to track him down. He goes back to his home country, which is a fictional country in the novel, Bamana, and doesn't know his girlfriend is pregnant when he goes back because his mother's ill. He stays and he becomes a guerrilla fighter against the colonialist regime and becomes the first president of the free country of Bamana. And our protagonist, Anna, goes back to find him, and much plot ensues. It got really thrillery in parts in the second half, and I wasn't sure if I liked that, but then I decided, yeah, it actually quite worked. There were some plot twists near the end that I'm still not sure I liked, but it had a really powerful ending. If I could suspend judgment on something that the father, the ex-president, did that got her into a lot of trouble, and how she maybe accepted that part, I'm still thinking about that. But then it moves past that point where she has a profound shamanic experience that I thought was just a powerful way to end the novel. If you do it, I recommend you do it on audio, with or without the text, but I certainly will be interested to see what Chibundu Onuzo does next. So those are what I finished. I'm ready to check in on two, one of which you don't know anything about unless you've been stalking my Goodreads. But I have now read the first story of Ghosts by Edith Wharton. I was very cynical and pessimistic about this in my brief reference to it at the end of last week's Friday Reads. So I'm very pleased to say that I love the first story, called All Souls. And it was an eerie story. I wouldn't call it a ghost story, but it certainly was a supernatural story about an old woman who twists her ankle. She's living alone in a big house because she refused to move out. She loved the house and her servants and the locale, and so when her husband died, she refused to move out. And so she's there alone with servants, and she twists her ankle. And the servants put her to bed that night, and nobody comes in the morning when she rings the bell, and she's in such pain. She's under strict orders not to move her leg, not to get out, but she does get out to find out where the servants, what's going on, and there's nobody in the house, and everything is turned off and very eerie. It freaked me out. That was a success. Obviously, I'm going to keep going with it. I'm having a Zoom chat with Chris of the Bookmakers, Dorian Stupert, and James Morrison in the mid-September, so I've got lots more to read, but maybe this is gonna... I got over my thing about ghosts in a novel, and maybe now I'm going to the next level where I'll get over stories that are about ghosts, predominantly. I said last week, I'm pretty sure I said, if anybody can cure me of this allergy, it would be Edith Wharton. That appears to have been true based on one story only. And there's been quite a bit of buzz about this book, and it sounded like a Sean book. I believe it was one of my subscribers that put a comment that first brought it to me, or certainly brought it more onto my radar, and I was planning to get to it some point this year, and then I suddenly had a brainwave. I finished the Danny Ramadan memoir that I read to Mary Jean, and I thought, oh, this novel sounds like such a Mary Jean book. So I told her about it, and she said, yeah, it sounds great. So I've just a little ways into reading it to her. And this is a debut novel that's getting a lot of attention out of America, The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. 2025 release, and it is an epistolary novel. And wow, is it engaging. Sybil Van Antwerp is a retired lawyer slash clerk to a judge. That's part of the story that's going to become pretty important. She is a mother. She's a grandmother, a distinguished lawyer, and she writes letters to everyone in her world, including the authors of the books that she enjoys. One of the first letters is actually an email to Anne Patchett, who blurbs the book. All I can say so far is it's really roping me in. There's a secret that's going to get revealed according to the synopsis, and her relationships with friends and neighbors and family. She's a bit crotchety. I think she's 70. And so there's a lot about aging. She's had a car accident. She wasn't hurt, but it caused a lot of damage to her car. And that's a thing, right? When people get older. So it's in a lot of my wheelhouses, at least at the beginning. Very excited to continue with The Correspondent. I'm going to be starting 3. Let me do the audiobook first because I'm liable to forget it because it's not a physical thing. This is a novel. I don't know if Bob the Booker put it on my radar, but he mentioned it, I think, in that chat we had. Or on his channel, maybe. And I usually have really good luck with Bob the Booker recommendations. And that is the British gay novel The Whale Tattoo by John Ransom. And I previewed the audio on Scribd, now called Kenmore or Evermore, or no, I know it's Everend. I can listen to it for free there. Not free, I pay my membership. And I so rarely use it, so I'm going to use it. Love the audio narrator's accent and voice, so I'm going to dive into that for my audiobook without a book in front of me. And at the end of September, the next book for my Patreon book club, we are discussing this work of history by Eleanor Barraclough, Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. This was one of the top votes, and so this is what we're going to read. And I don't know anything about Vikings that I didn't learn when I was about 8 or 9 years old. So this is going to be an eye-opener for me. This was on the Women's Nonfiction Prize long list this year, last year, whenever. And it's supposed to be really good. So I'm going to start that. And I'm going to do a twofer here. I've got 8 days left in Women in Translation Month. Not that I really care. I start a bunch of stuff when I do these readathon things that I finish long after. That's my modus operandi. But I'm going to sneak this one in, which is also one of the novellas that I have assigned to Barb Howard and will be reading myself for the first time for our novella project. And that is the Japanese novella Hunchback by Saou Ichikawa, translated from the Japanese by Polly Barton. And it's also on audio, and I previewed the audio. I'm going to do it definitely as a combo, but the audio sounded great, so I'm going to dive into that. That's what I've got to say. What do you have to say? Thanks for watching.